I'm going to start off by telling you a small personal story that always leaves me rather chagrined to tell it. And yet I think the power of this story is quite potent and important to speak out loud. Several years ago, I was flown out to Philadelphia for a job interview, and I landed in the Philadelphia airport quite late at night. I was getting picked up by a friend, and I was tired. I was walking through the terminal to find the baggage claim area, pick up my luggage, and meet up with my friend. And as I was walking down the terminal, I noticed some imagery on a monitor hanging from the ceiling. And it was four pictures, four images in each of the quadrants of the screen. And there was some yellow lettering or font. I couldn't quite make out either the images or the lettering. But as I got closer, even though I couldn't still make everything out, nor could I read what it said, I saw that the imagery had four black men. And I immediately thought, wow, something's going down. And I started to begin to feel unsafe. And my mind started thinking about, oh, well, it's a really good thing I'm getting picked up. I'm not quite sure what's going on. I should probably check the news, etc., etc., etc. As I approached the monitor, I could now see the images and the lettering. The pictures were four images of Martin Luther King. The lettering said, "Happy Martin Luther King Day." This is always, always tough for me to tell this story. So, what's the moral of this story? Well, when I saw the TV screen, my brain automatically made a decision, an unconscious one, but a decision nonetheless. What I really did was make an assumption. I saw images on a screen and assumed something, made up a story, and then that story or assumption became my reality. So the question is, how did I make that assumption? Well, the point is, I'm biased. Let's take a moment and define bias so that we're all on the same page. Bias is simply the grouping of data. It refers to a preference or tendency or inclination. And what's important here is that bias allows us to distinguish from what we deem as safe versus that which we deem dangerous. Bias is super helpful because it allows us to rapidly and often automatically categorize information. In essence, bias is what allows us to group data together. You can think of bias like this. Your brain acts like a database, storing a ton of information, lots of data, and a whole bunch of images. When you're looking at something, your brain is acting as the database, searching for and scanning to find what's most familiar so you can understand it, so that you can make sense of it. Like when a car is coming toward you while you're crossing the street, if you had to sit there for an hour evaluating the object, you might get hit. So bias quickly groups all of that data as this huge, big object coming toward you, and you react. In this case, you might react by jumping out of the way or hurrying out of the street. This is why bias is so important. It allows you to figure out what's safe or not quickly and make a decision. However, where we get into trouble is when we make assumptions we don't even realize we're making. Just as in the case of my story in Philadelphia. So, how does our brain work in regards to bias? We have to start by thinking of our brain as really three brains. Technically, this is called the triune brain. This diagram shows the three brains starting from the left to the right on the screen. The first is called the lizard brain. Some people also call this the reptilian brain. If you touch the back of your neck at the base of the skull, this is where your reptilian brain can be found. Just above your reptilian brain is your mammalian brain. I personally call this the limbic brain. If you place your fingers just above your ears, this would be the general location of the limbic brain. And finally, your neocortex. And if you touch your forehead, this is where your prefrontal cortex can be found. The reptilian brain runs your bodily functions on autopilot. Very helpful. So you don't have to worry about your blood circulating or think about inhaling to get oxygen to the brain. It's all done for you. The key word, as you probably guessed, is autopilot. In fact, did you know that 95% of your thoughts throughout a 24-hour period are actually unconscious? The limbic brain is where emotions happen and where you store your memories. And finally, the neocortex. This is where innovation, creation, and analysis happens. You would make your vision board here with this part of your brain, or you'd build your marketing strategy or create a PowerPoint of the brain. So now that we have a brief and general overview of the brain, let's get back to bias and see where it fits into the picture. Your reptilian brain is busy. It's very, very busy. At the brain stem is something called the reticular formation, as you can see here in this picture. It's made up of a series of long nerve pathways that help you balance sensory inputs and transmit information to and from the neocortex. This reticular formation is responsible for managing a variety of functions like heart rate, digestion, perspiration, and even sexual arousal and consciousness. The reticular activating system, RAS, is actually the mechanism that keeps the brain alert and awake. It receives information, like the oncoming car, and sends that information to the cortex to keep it alert and primed for environmental changes. This is a key point here. Let's say you decide to buy a new car. For whatever reason, you choose a silver Prius. The next day, you're out and about, and you start noticing that there are silver Priuses everywhere. This happened to me recently when I rented a Hyundai Elantra. Now I see Elantras everywhere I go. Your RAS, reticular activating system, determines that something is of value, whether it should be avoided or not. Once that data goes into your database, like the silver Prius, then your RAS scans for them all the time. When we get into trouble is when we don't monitor our actions. Remember my MLK story? What's important here? I will never stop having bias. I can't. It's part of the RAS, which saves my life thousands of times a day. We need to start thinking about bias as a good thing, like a part of a device's operating system that runs hundreds of applications in the background. But what's important for us is to not get hijacked by spyware. So we should make a point of being aware of what we're thinking so that we make less and less assumptions, or at least have awareness around the assumptions we're making. If I ask you to choose which one you'd prefer, you might pick one. You might also say you don't drink soda or pop, depending on what part of the country you're from. But regardless, if you choose one or don't, that is still bias. Remember, the definition of bias is a tendency or preference or inclination. And my inclination is that I don't like soda, so I hardly ever drink it. Part of becoming a masterful self-regulator is noticing our assumptions, our thoughts, and how we are perceiving the world around us. As we start to notice how our RAS is pointing us in a particular direction, we can begin to shift the way we think and allow ourselves to have different experiences. The philosophy at iRestart is to constantly ask ourselves whether our actions are inviting us to be in relation with others or to be right, especially when it comes to our assumptions or bias.